My name is Claire Madden, and I used to believe that talent would always rise to the top. I was 32, had spent 7 years building my career at Haven and Bright, one of Chicago's most prestigious creative agencies. And I thought I understood how the game worked. Hard work plus brilliant ideas equals success. Simple math, right? I was wrong about everything. The fluorescent lights in Conference Room B hummed their usual mechanical lullaby as I sat in my designated corner seat, the one that had somehow become mine through months of strategic early arrivals. My notebook lay open, filled with the kind of meticulous planning that had earned me the reputation as someone who really thought things through. Graham Lockhart stood at the front of the room, his Tom Ford suit immaculate, his smile the kind that made clients write checks. "What I'm about to show you," Graham announced, clicking his presentation remote with theatrical flair, "is going to revolutionize how we think about brand authenticity." The slide that appeared on screen was mine. Every pixel, every font choice, every carefully crafted transition. I'd finished it at 3 in the morning, fueled by cold coffee and the kind of creative fire that only strikes when you're alone with your thoughts and a blank canvas. But Graham's name was in the corner where mine should have been. I watched him present my authentic voice framework to the room full of executives. Watched him gesture with the same passion I had felt when the concept first came to me during a late-night brainstorming session. He even used my exact phrasing. "We're not selling products, we're selling permission to belong." The room was captivated. They always were when Graham spoke. He had that rare combination of confidence and charm that made people lean forward in their chairs, that made them believe they were witnessing something extraordinary. And they just didn't know who had created it. This wasn't the first time. Over the past 18 months, I'd watched Graham transform from what I thought was a mentor into something else entirely. Something that wore expensive suits and spoke in buzzwords and took credit for late-night breakthroughs that belonged to someone else. I had started at Haven and Bright fresh out of Northwestern, armed with a portfolio that had landed me the job despite fierce competition. The agency was known for its innovative campaigns, its ability to make brands feel human in an increasingly digital world. I thought I had found my home. Graham had been assigned as my supervisor. And for the first few years, everything seemed perfect. He was brilliant, no doubt about it. He had an instinct for what clients wanted before they knew they wanted it. He could walk into a room and read the energy like a seasoned poker player. When he spoke, people listened. But somewhere along the way, the dynamic had shifted. It started small. A suggestion here, a collaboration there. Graham would ask me to develop concepts for pitches, to really dig deep into the strategic thinking. I was flattered. I thought he was grooming me for bigger things. The first time I noticed my work presented without my name attached, I told myself it was standard practice. Agencies were collaborative environments. After all, the work belonged to the team, not to individuals. When Graham presented my campaign structure for the Meridian Bank account, I felt a small twist in my stomach, but I convinced myself it was just ego talking. The second time, with the Cascade Coffee rebrand, the twist became a knot. Graham had taken my entire brand positioning document, changed the font from Helvetica to Futura, and presented it as his own strategic vision. When the client raved about the innovative approach, Graham basked in the praise while I sat in the back of the room, invisible. By the third time, I knew what was happening, but knowing and proving are two different things. Graham was careful. He never took credit overtly. Instead, he would position himself as the strategic architect while I was the excellent executor. He would praise my attention to detail while positioning himself as the big-picture thinker. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting, and I was the star pupil. The gift cards started appearing on my desk around this time. A $20 Starbucks card here, a $50 Amazon credit there. Never with a note, but always after a major presentation where my work had been rebranded as Graham's vision. I understood the message. These were my participation trophies, my consolation prizes for playing along. I began to document everything, not because I had a plan, but because something deep in my gut told me I would need proof someday. I created a private cloud storage account, started saving every email, every draft, every iteration of every project. I bought an encrypted USB drive and named the folder Lighthouse because I needed something to guide me through the darkness that was slowly consuming my career. The Nova Roots campaign was supposed to be different. It was Haven and Bright's biggest account of the year, a sustainable fashion brand that wanted to position itself as the future of ethical retail. I had spent 3 months developing the strategy, working nights and weekends to craft a narrative that would resonate with conscious consumers without feeling preachy. The campaign was built around the concept of roots and wings, honoring where you came from while embracing where you were going. I had developed consumer personas, mapped out the entire customer journey, created a content framework that would work across every platform from TikTok to billboards. It was the best work I'd ever done, and I knew Graham would try to take it. I was checking the metadata on the final presentation file when I saw it, Graham's name as the document author. He had somehow managed to save the file under his credentials, making it appear as though he had created the entire presentation from scratch. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about taking credit. This was about erasure. Graham wasn't just stealing my ideas, he was rewriting history to make it seem like I had never existed at all. I started setting traps. The first trap was simple. I began including deliberate errors in my work. A misplaced decimal point in a budget projection. A typo in a client's company name. A slide that referenced a competitor that didn't exist. Small mistakes that any careful review would catch. But that would reveal whether Graham was actually examining the work or just slapping his name on it. He failed every test, every single one. When Graham presented the Apex Electronics strategy with a budget line item for photo shoots, spelled as photo shoots, a mistake I had deliberately included, I knew I had him. When he stood in front of the client and referenced market research from Q3 2023 in a February 2024 presentation, I documented it. When he confidently cited statistics from a fictitious study I had created, I recorded the entire meeting. I called these my tripwires, and I kept a detailed log of every time Graham walked into one. The document grew longer, each week. But the traps revealed something else, something that made my blood run cold. Graham wasn't working alone. The entire system was designed to protect him. When I finally worked up the courage to approach HR about the credit issue, the meeting was a masterclass in corporate deflection. Jessica from Human Resources listened with the practiced sympathy of someone who had been trained to diffuse situations rather than solve them. "I understand your frustration, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with concern. "But you have to understand, in collaborative environments like ours, it can be difficult to trace exactly where ideas originate. The important thing is that you're contributing to the team's success." She suggested I work on my communication style and be more proactive about claiming ownership of my contributions. The subtext was clear. If I wasn't getting credit, it was my fault for not being assertive enough. After the meeting, I sat in my car in the parking garage and cried for 20 minutes. Not because I was sad, but because I was angry. Angrier than I had ever been in my life. I began to see the network of enablers that surrounded Graham, the colleagues who looked the other way when he took credit for other people's work. The PR department that positioned him as the strategic mastermind behind every successful campaign. The senior management who promoted him based on work they didn't realize he had stolen. Graham had built an ecosystem of willful ignorance, and I was trapped in the center of it. The isolation was the worst part. When I tried to confide in Sarah, a fellow strategist who had been at the agency for 5 years, she listened politely, but then offered the kind of advice that made me want to scream. "You're probably being too sensitive," she said. "Graham is really smart. Maybe he's just building on your ideas in ways you don't see." When I mentioned the credit issue to Marcus, one of the senior creatives, he actually laughed. "Welcome to agency life," he said. "Everyone's work gets mixed up. That's how the best ideas happen." But the most devastating conversation was with Emma, who had been my closest friend at the agency. I had expected her to be outraged on my behalf, to offer support or at least validation. Instead, she seemed uncomfortable, shifting in her seat as I explained what was happening. "I don't know, Claire," she said finally. "You've been pretty negative lately. Maybe you should focus on the bigger picture instead of keeping score. I realized then that I had been marked somewhere along the way. I had been labeled as difficult or overly sensitive or not a team player. The narrative had been written, and I was the villain in my own story. The final straw came when I saw the job posting. I had been refreshing LinkedIn obsessively, as had become my habit during lunch breaks, when I saw it. VP of Strategic Development, Haven and Bright. It was the position Graham had been hinting about for months, the one he had suggested might be perfect for someone with your skills. I clicked on the posting with trembling fingers. The job description was a perfect match for my experience. The responsibilities were exactly what I had been doing, just with a fancier title and a salary that would finally make my student loans feel manageable. I searched for my name in the company directory, hoping to find some internal posting I had missed. Nothing. I checked my email for any communication about the position. Nothing. That evening, I typed my own name into the search function on Haven and Bright's website. The results were devastating. 3 mentions, all in group photos, all without captions identifying who I was. 7 years of work, countless successful campaigns. And I had been reduced to a face in a crowd. I wasn't being groomed for promotion, I was being mined for ideas. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on proving myself worthy of recognition that I had missed the fundamental truth. I was never meant to be recognized. I was meant to be a source, not a person. A generator of ideas that could be harvested and rebranded and sold under someone else's name. I was a ghost in my own career. That night, I started planning my exit, not just from Haven and Bright, but from the entire situation. I was going to document everything, organize it, and find a way to make people see the truth. I called it the file. The file began as a simple timeline, but it quickly evolved into something more complex. I mapped out every stolen idea, every missed credit, every strategic decision that had been attributed to Graham when it should have been attributed to me. I cross-referenced email timestamps with presentation dates, matched client feedback to original concepts, traced the evolution of ideas from my drafts to Graham's final presentations. The documentation was exhaustive. I had screenshots of Slack conversations where I had shared initial concepts, email chains where I had sent strategic frameworks, voice recordings from brainstorming sessions where I had pitched ideas that would later become Graham's vision. But the most damning evidence was in the metadata. Every document tells a story if you know how to read it. Creation dates, modification histories, authorship records. It was all there, hidden in the digital DNA of every file. I spent 3 weeks building the file, working in secret, staying late at the office to access systems I might not have access to from home. I organized everything chronologically, thematically, by client, by campaign. I created a master index with cross-references and supporting documentation. And then I wrote the narrative. For each piece of evidence, I recorded a voice memo explaining the context, the timeline, the significance. I spoke like a lawyer presenting to a jury, laying out the case piece by piece, building toward an inevitable conclusion. The voice memos were the hardest part. Recording myself explaining how I had been systematically erased from my own work felt like testifying about my own murder. But I forced myself to be clinical, objective, factual. I let the evidence speak for itself. The final piece of the file was what I called the Horizon Pulse Trap. Horizon Pulse was a fictional project I created specifically to catch Graham in the act. I developed a complete brand strategy for a made-up wellness company, complete with consumer research, competitive analysis, and a full creative brief. I made sure the work was exceptional, the kind of strategic thinking that would make executives sit up and take notice. I presented the project to Graham as a concept I had been developing in my spare time, something that might be perfect for one of our existing clients. I watched his eyes light up as he reviewed the materials, watched him nod and make notes and ask probing questions that I knew he would later present as his own insights. 2 weeks later, Graham scheduled a board meeting to present his innovative approach to wellness branding. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but I had prepared for that possibility. I'd given him a version of the presentation with subtle flaws built in, incorrect market sizing data, a competitor analysis that included a company that had gone out of business, a demographic breakdown that didn't add up to 100%. The meeting was a disaster. Graham, confident in his command of the material, presented the flawed data as fact. When the board members started asking questions, he couldn't answer them. When they pointed out the mathematical errors, he fumbled for explanations that didn't exist. I watched the entire debacle through the glass walls of the conference room, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was what it had come to, sabotaging my own work to prove that someone else was stealing it. 3 days later, I was fired. The termination meeting was surreal. Graham sat across from me, his face a mask of professional concern, while Jessica from HR delivered the news with practiced empathy. "We've decided to go in a different direction," she said. "Your skill set just doesn't align with our evolving creative vision." Graham nodded gravely. "You're incredibly talented, Claire. This isn't about your abilities, it's about fit." I wanted to laugh, or scream, or both. Instead, I nodded and asked about the timeline for my departure. I cleaned out my desk with the dignity of someone who had been expecting this moment for months. I said goodbye to colleagues who seemed genuinely sorry to see me go, but not sorry enough to ask why I was leaving. As I walked out of Haven and Bright for the last time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The weight of pretending that everything was normal, of swallowing my anger and frustration, of being complicit in my own erasure. It was finally off my shoulders. But I wasn't done, not even close. I had been researching investigative journalists for weeks, looking for someone who specialized in corporate malfeasance, someone who would understand the significance of what I had documented. Miles Thatcher's name kept coming up. Thatcher was a senior correspondent for Industry Sentinel, a publication that had built its reputation on exposing corporate corruption and executive misconduct. He had broken stories about fraudulent marketing practices, discriminatory hiring policies, and financial irregularities that had brought down CEOs and shuttered companies. More importantly, he had a reputation for protecting his sources and telling their stories with the kind of nuanced understanding that comes from someone who has spent years navigating corporate politics. I reached out to him through an encrypted messaging app, explaining that I had information about systematic creative theft at a major advertising agency. I was careful not to reveal too much in the initial contact, but I made it clear that I had documentation that would be of interest to him. He responded within hours, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, far from the advertising district where I might be recognized. The meeting was everything I'd hoped for, and nothing I had expected. Thatcher was younger than I had imagined, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that comes from someone who has learned to listen for the stories that matter. I had prepared for skepticism, for questions about my motivations, for the kind of journalistic interrogation that would test the strength of my evidence. Instead, Thatcher listened with the quiet intensity of someone who had heard similar stories before. "How long has this been going on?" he asked after I had outlined the basic situation. "Systematically, about 2 years, but I think it started earlier, in smaller ways." He nodded. "And you have documentation?" I slid the encrypted USB drive across the table. Everything. Timestamps, metadata, voice recordings, email chains, a complete timeline with supporting evidence. Thatcher picked up the drive, turning it over in his hands. "Why now? Why not go through internal channels?" I did try. The system is designed to protect people like Graham. I realized that the only way to get justice was to go outside the system. He studied my face for a long moment. "You understand that this will likely end your career in advertising? Chicago is a small industry. People talk." I had thought about this extensively. My career was already over. They just hadn't told me yet. Thatcher spent the next hour going through the evidence I had provided, asking detailed questions about timelines, processes, and the corporate structure at Haven and Bright. He was particularly interested in the pattern of behavior, the systematic nature of the credit theft. "This isn't just about one bad manager," he said finally. This is about an entire culture that enables and rewards this kind of behavior. That was exactly what I had hoped he would understand. 3 weeks later, Industry Sentinel published the story under the headline, "The Idea Thief: How a Creative Director Built His Career on Stolen Work." The article was devastating. Thatcher had not only used my evidence, but had conducted his own investigation, interviewing former employees, examining public records, and tracking down clients who had worked with Graham over the years. He had found other victims, other people whose work had been appropriated and rebranded. The story included side-by-side comparisons of original work and Graham's presentations, metadata analysis that proved authorship, and audio recordings that demonstrated the systematic nature of the theft. It was thorough, professional, and utterly damning. But the most powerful part of the article was the way Thatcher had framed the issue. He didn't just focus on Graham's individual misconduct. He examined the broader culture that had enabled it. He interviewed experts about creative theft in the advertising industry, explored the legal and ethical implications of idea appropriation, and placed the Haven and Bright situation in the context of a much larger problem. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The article was shared thousands of times on social media, picked up by other publications, and discussed on industry podcasts. The hashtags the Lockhart leak and Credit Claire began trending on Twitter. But I wasn't on social media to see it. I had decided to go dark, to let the story speak for itself without getting caught up in the circus that inevitably follows this kind of exposure. I learned about the aftermath through carefully curated news alerts and the occasional text from former colleagues. Graham was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours of the article's publication. Haven and Bright released a statement saying they were conducting a thorough investigation and were committed to maintaining the highest standards of creative integrity. Major clients began pulling their accounts. The Meridian Bank contract was terminated. Cascade Coffee announced they were reviewing their relationship with the agency. Nova Roots issued a statement distancing themselves from Graham and announcing their intention to work directly with the actual strategists who had developed their campaign. Within a week, Graham's profile had been removed from Haven and Bright's website. His LinkedIn account went dark. The industry publications that had once quoted him as a strategic visionary were now dissecting his fall from grace. I watched it all from the safety of my apartment, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. I had gotten what I wanted: justice, recognition, acknowledgement of what had been done to me. But I had also witnessed the destruction of a career, the unraveling of a life built on lies. The part of me that had once believed in redemption, in the possibility that people could change, felt sorry for Graham. But the part of me that had spent 2 years being erased, being gaslighted, being told that my anger was misplaced and my concerns were invalid, that part felt only satisfaction. I never revealed myself as the source of the story. Thatcher had protected my identity completely, referring to me only as a former employee who wished to remain anonymous. I had no interest in becoming a public figure, in being the poster child for workplace justice or creative rights. I just wanted Graham to stop stealing from people, and he had. The industry conversation that followed was exactly what I had hoped for. People began sharing their own stories of creative theft, of ideas appropriated and credit stolen. The article had opened a door that couldn't be closed, started a conversation that couldn't be stopped. New policies were implemented at agencies across the city. Creative attribution became a standard part of presentation protocols. Young strategists and creatives were encouraged to document their work, to protect their intellectual property, to speak up when they felt their contributions were being overlooked. Change was happening, real, systemic change. I sit in a coffee shop now, 6 months after the story broke, working on my laptop in the kind of anonymity I once craved. The USB drive with the file is in my bag, but I don't need to open it anymore. Its contents have been absorbed into the public record, its purpose fulfilled. I'm freelancing now, working with smaller agencies and independent clients who value authenticity over politics. My reputation, such as it is, has been rebuilt on the foundation of the work I can prove I created. It's a smaller world than the one I once inhabited, but it's mine. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had spoken up sooner. If I had been more assertive about claiming credit for my work, but I think I know the answer, I would have been labeled as difficult, as not a team player, as someone who didn't understand how the industry worked. The system was designed to silence people like me. The only way to beat it was to step outside it entirely. I learned that justice isn't something you're given, it's something you take, and sometimes the only way to take it is to burn everything down and start over. My name is Claire Madden. I used to believe that talent would always rise to the top. Now I know better. Now I know that talent rises to the top only when it's allowed to, and if it's not allowed to, sometimes you have to make your own way up. The laptop screen glows in the afternoon light, and I begin typing the proposal for my next project. This time, my name will be on every page. This time, I'll make sure of it.